I just can't concentrate. The thing is, sweetie, the problem is this video, it's got lots of policy in it. And policy means talking about politics, and some of our viewers get really, really weird about politics. Not all of them, just some. I know it's really late, but maybe I should just check in with Nikki tonight and see if she really wants me to do it tomorrow. Because I got to get filming in the morning and it's just going to be...
You should do it. It'll be hilarious. Shouty Bob will get all angry in the comments section and start ranting about lizard people.
You should do it. It's informative and people should know how this works. Wait. Shouldn't you and you be arguing? Normally you're the one telling me to do something terrible and you tell me to do good things. What's going on?
Well, usually when we agree, it's extremely funny.
Well, when she's right, she's right. Shit. Okay, so you all asked, and here we are. We are gonna wade into the slushy, slimy weeds of subsidies. And no, I'm not just going to talk about electric vehicle subsidies. I mean electric vehicle versus gasoline subsidies and other fossil fuel subsidies. You'll ask for this, so this one is a case of be careful what you wish for. Back when we did the video on EV sales, we mentioned the fact that many in North America and in Europe are concerned that China's gone around subsidizing EV research, development and manufacturing for a long time. And now manufacturers based there that benefited from that research are producing electric vehicles that are cheaper and better spec'd than their North American and European manufacturers' counterparts. And many in North America and the EU feel that it's mean and unfair of them to do that. And so you all asked us to look at subsidies. Not just the subsidies that China's given to, quote, its new energy vehicle manufacturers, but also the subsidies that pour into the coffers of oil companies and manufacturers producing legacy fossil fuel vehicles. So today we're going to talk about that, and we're going to start with the definition of subsidies, because that is kind of complicated. Now, the Cambridge English Dictionary, well, it defines subsidies as... Kate, you're stealing a bit from Abigail Thorne. Who did this? Subsidies, at least government subsidies, are generally considered an economic benefit that's given by the government to companies or individuals. The purpose of that subsidy is either to lower the price that you, as a consumer, pays, or to raise the price that the company producing said product receives. It can also be used, as it has been used in EV production, to reduce the effective cost of production of that product. For those who are interested, apparently subsidies are an English invention dating back to the 1500s, when the legislature of the Kingdom of England, the King, created a tax to finance military expenditures. Now, this is where it starts to get complicated. And believe me, it is complicated, because what people consider a subsidy varies pretty dramatically. For example, in a 2008 study, there was a 200-fold difference between the low and high estimates of US subsidies given to motor vehicle users. That difference is because some analysts consider anything that favours a particular industry or that causes an industry's prices to fall below what is considered fair market value for their products to be a subsidy. And of course, what a fair price is also incredibly difficult to calculate. Should the fair market price of oil include, say, a chunk to cover the healthcare and climate change costs, as well as, say, the costs to try and remediate environmental damages? Or should they not? And if they should, how far out should those costs be calculated? In some jurisdictions where local, state or provincial governments have the power to set taxes, government subsidies can be targeted to an individual firm, trying to, say, encourage them to build a plant within its borders by providing a property tax holiday or some other financial incentive. An interesting example of this is Rivian, which Georgia, the state, not the country, offered a $1.5 incentive package to encourage Rivian to build its new factory in the state of many peach pits. Under the project's economic development agreement, Rivian must meet 80% of its commitment to spend $5 billion and create 7,500 jobs by the end of 2030 and through 2049. It's an agreement which has been rather publicly discussed because of Rivian's decision to slow the construction of its facility there. Unsurprisingly, many economists adopt a much narrower approach to what constitutes a subsidy than, normal people. Was that Kate snarking about economists being about as useful as the original Pentium floating point unit? That's unheard of. Instead, many economists only consider direct subsidies as a subsidy. So direct cash assistance would count, and for some, but not all, Rivian's tax holiday would count as a subsidy. But say last in, first out accounting, in which oil companies can sell the fuel they most recently added to their reserves, i.e. the most expensive fuel, first, thus reducing the value of their inventory, on which they might be taxed, or utilising the financial structure of a Master Limited Partnership, or MLP. This is a type of company in which shareholders still pay personal income tax, but the MLP itself is exempt from corporate income taxes. Did you know that around 3/4 of MLPs are fossil fuel companies? I didn't. Also, did you know that renewable energy companies are not eligible to be MLPs? It's funny that. Yeah, that wouldn't count to many economists as a subsidy. So for the purposes of the subsidy discussion, I'm aside with the people who are researchers, not the economists. And not just because I think economists are broadly large-scale producers of bovine byproduct, but because I think realistically all sorts of things count as an incentive to companies to produce one particular product over another. The rise of SUVs in the US isn't because of a direct incentive, nor because people were crying out for more large, ugly vehicles, but because of the perverse regulatory situation where they have an easier to meet fuel efficiency standard and more lax safety requirements. Automakers can make cheaply built, grottier, but bigger cars and sell them for much more profit. That's not what many economists would consider a subsidy, but it is certainly an incentive. In that estimation of subsidies provided to motor vehicle owners done back in 2008, 4 different types of taxes were considered as subsidies. Corporate income taxes on motor vehicles and motor fuel industries, sales taxes on motor vehicles, fuel and vehicle services, property taxes on roadways, and personal income taxes not paid on the value of employer-provided free parking. And of course we should add to that, particularly in North America, where free or vastly discounted parking is a common benefit, parking at or near shopping and recreational facilities for free. We should also add to, for fossil fuel vehicles, the cleanup costs for legacy low-producing wells. A recent study from the Carbon Tracker Initiative states that more than half of the unplugged oil and gas wells in the state of Colorado won't make enough money from this point forwards to cover their own decommissioning. The report finds that more than 27,000 wells will need decommissioning at a cost of at least $4 billion. But they'll only actually raise about $1 billion before they close. The rest of that bill will almost certainly fall to the taxpayer. And that's definitely a subsidy, at least in my mind. Economists also generally fail to include what's termed a negative externality. These are things like climate change costs, environmental damage, health problems up to and including premature death, So ocean acidification, sea level rise, plastic pollution, air pollution, oil spills, treatment for asthma, cancer, diabetes, heart disease, etc. All these things are met either by individuals or by the state, or more often first one then by the other. And instead of those costs being rolled into, for example, the price of oil through appropriate taxation, we as a society are, and have been, covering the fossil fuel industry's tab on these since the birth of the Industrial Revolution. And this is what leads to the ridiculous situation we now have, where the levels of subsidies and other incentives we have created make it economically viable to pull fossil fuels out of the ground in Alaska, despite the fact it takes more energy to pull them out of the ground and refine them than we'll actually get by burning them, and despite the harm that they're doing to both us and the planet. The same net negative energy situation will be true for North Sea oil, incidentally, in less than a decade. Historically, these subsidies granted to the fossil fuel industry, both in the US and in Europe, were intended to lower the cost of fossil fuel production and incentivize new domestic energy sources. But rather than adapting to new, cleaner, cheaper, less damaging energy production methods, the historic subsidies and incentives have remained in place. Okay, so we have this complex situation where what is and what isn't a subsidy is kind of nebulous, but can we come up with an idea of how much EVs have been subsidized in comparison to, say, fossil fuels and fossil fuel-powered vehicles? Now, while I love a good spreadsheet, we are but one small channel, and to dig into how much each state and country is quietly slipping fossil fuel majors cash under the table would take a massive research team and a lot of time. Also, I'm well aware that some of you all think I'm weird for loving a good spreadsheet, but spreadsheets are awesome. But a bunch of studies have looked at fossil fuel subsidies, and EV studies generally get reported because some, how shall I put this? Some of those on the opposite end of the political spectrum to myself get rather het up about how much these terrible EVs are being subsidized, so like to shout about it. There have also been a bunch of studies examining whether EV subsidies and incentives are actually effective. So in January 2024, the Environmental and Energy Study Institute, or EESI, released a fact sheet examining fossil fuel subsidies. It does this with reasonable frequency. It reported that, according to the notoriously lefty advocacy group, the International Monetary Fund, just to be absolutely clear, because I've got in trouble for this before, that was sarcasm. The IMF is very conservative. And it reported that fossil fuels received $757 billion, yes, with a B, dollars in subsidies. That included $3 billion of explicit subsidies, so that's basically cash given directly to fossil fuel companies to get stuff out of the ground and process it, and another $754 billion of implicit subsidies, like, you know, not having to clear up the pollution and cap off your oil well, or not paying healthcare costs for the region in Louisiana where the cancer rate is 50 times higher than the national average because of the more than 100 refining and extracting plants in the region. You know, little tiny insignificant things like that. And just to be clear, we're not magically getting this money back in taxation. In fiscal year 2022, subsidies exceeded tax revenues by $2.1 billion. Yes, again, billion with a B. Part of this is that the Trump administration created something called the Global Intangible Low Tax Income Regime when it introduced a bunch of other corporate tax cuts. This system enables fossil fuel companies to further reduce their tax burden on foreign-generated profits. Theoretically, it maxes out at 13.125%, but often, because of the taxes applied in foreign countries and some deductions that they're allowed, for example, 10% deducted for tangible assets like factories, then you only use 50% of the remaining profits for the calculation, then subtract credits for 80% of taxes paid abroad. By the end of all this sleight of hand, oil and gas companies can often end up paying no tax at all in the US on foreign profits. And weirdly, a lot of fossil fuel companies seem to have foreign tax bases for, I'm sure, no related reason. In the EU, things are going much better.
Now look, even I draw the line at lying like that.
Go away. All right. Here's a graph of how things are going in the EU. Yeah, so between 2015 and 2021, things were pretty stable with just, 56-ish billion euro per year being expended on fossil fuels. But following Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine and with the ongoing chaos following COVID, things are even less rosy than they were before, with more than double that, 123 billion euro going to fossil fuel subsidies in 2022. To quote the European Environment Agency, most EU member states have no concrete plans on how and when they will phase out these subsidies. Therefore, it is unlikely, but uncertain, that the EU will make much progress towards phasing out fossil fuel subsidies by 2030. So, yay that. But I do have some good news to report. In December 2021, the British government stated, "The UK does not give any subsidies to fossil fuels and follows the approach of the International Energy Agency, which defines fossil fuel subsidies as measures that reduce the effective price of fossil fuels below world market prices." So that's nice and unambiguous, isn't it?
Yeah, found that. That was one of mine. I thought it was very funny.
Yeah, you would. You're a bad influence. Anyway, that's a statement so improbable that I'm amazed the heart of gold did not just spontaneously materialize right here and now as I said it. The magic is, of course, all in that last part of the sentence, defining subsidies as something that reduces the effective price of fossil fuels below world market prices. We've already seen that fossil fuels are subsidized worldwide, so pretending that the money that the UK is throwing at UK oil production to keep the output price competitive with other countries' oil production isn't a subsidy unless you just happen to make it cheaper per barrel than other countries isn't. Well, it's not so much a sleight of hand as sleight of entire GDP. And when you ask the OECD, it takes a slightly different view of the situation than the UK government, stating that in 2021, the UK's subsidies were nearer £10 billion. While I haven't been able to find a figure for 2022 or 2023, given the pressures on fossil fuel prices were felt across the world, I'd be willing to bet a red swingline stapler on that value having gone up dramatically. Now, overall, worldwide, the OECD estimated that the purely fiscal cost for government support for fossil fuels almost doubled in 2022 to reach more than $1.4 trillion US. That's trillion with a T, and that, to be clear, is support, not specifically subsidies, and is a somewhat broader calculation than the pure subsidies that economists favour. However, in contrast, the IMF states that estimates for fossil fuel subsidies were around $7 trillion, 5 times higher than the OECD estimate for support, not subsidies. So it's reasonable to estimate that support for fossil fuel companies may be even more than that, especially when you take into account the fact that there are negative externalities, which back in 2015 were estimated to cost $5.3 trillion globally. Now, to also be clear, this isn't including the kind of specific subsidies that, encourage car companies to build and sell SUVs and, in North America, giant but also impractically small bedded pickup trucks. It's not including the societal cost of paving so much of the country that when you build a game you can't model it accurately because it's apparent how stupid it is, especially given the requirements are literally made up. I'm talking about SimCity here, which decided not to try and model American cities, roads and parking lot use because if they did it accurately, the game was awful and unplayable and looked frankly ridiculous. And it's not including things like company car purchase subsidies, which back in 2020, Transport and Environment found amounted to €32 billion in Europe, spent mostly on highly polluting gasoline and diesel vehicles. And it's not going into the kind of depth that Penn Future did with its examination of Pennsylvania's fossil fuel subsidies, where they identified more than 50 rather cunning ways that fossil fuels are quietly supported by state and local governments. But despite that, I would say, to an accuracy of 1 Randall Munroe, a solid value to take a punt on for the amount of support and subsidies given to fossil fuel industries last year was probably around $10 trillion. So let's take that $10 trillion per year internationally and compare it to, say, the subsidies provided to EVs. Well, between 2009 and 2023, the Chinese government invested $230.9 billion, with a B, dollars in EVs. That's over a 14-year period, but to be fair, the country invested the vast bulk of that in the last few years. However, China has now reduced its support of the new energy vehicle industry. The best estimate I've found is that it spent around 39 billion yuan, or about $5.5 billion, supporting new energy vehicle sales in 2023. The majority of that money went to BYD and Tesla, incidentally. This is interesting because it means that EU and US companies were indeed eligible for the incentives for work that they did in the country, and they could have chosen to benefit from them and use that in their own R&D elsewhere. It doesn't appear that they all took advantage of that. And I have to say here, I am really strongly resisting the urge to say, well, stop whining about it then, you chose not to take the money. China also spent around 20 billion yuan, or about $2.8 billion, on charging infrastructure and promoting electric vehicles. Now, in addition, as in the US and Europe, there are other provincial incentives which you can't easily include because they're kind of difficult to find. For example, Auto News reports that Hunan province said that it will provide subsidies between 1.5 and 50 million yuan, up to $7 billion, for certain types of new energy vehicle and related infrastructure investment in the province. However, it should also be noted that China has eliminated the buyer's subsidies for purchasing an EV as of the end of 2022, but does still have in place a purchase tax exemption. That's till 2027 at the moment. The situation is a little different in the EU. Unlike both the US and China, EU automotive industries can't receive direct subsidies from EU member states. That doesn't mean there aren't incentives. There have been plenty. From discounts at the point of purchase, reduced or total exemption from taxation or purchase taxes. But this year we've seen multiple EU member states end their purchase subsidies, which has led to a more challenging marketplace for EVs, which are not quite at cost parity to build. Back in 2022, the ACEA suggested the EU needed to invest around €280 billion, around $300 billion, in charging infrastructure to meet its electrification goals. But I have not seen nor found anything anywhere to suggest that anything like that level of investment occurred. Digging into the European Commission's European Alternative Fuel Observatory website, many countries don't provide information regarding the amount of funding they've allocated to their EV programs. The Netherlands, a country which rather nicely does, allocates a paltry €17.2 million. Basically, if you look up the word opaque in the dictionary, it says adjective, of or relating to EU EV subsidies. So instead, let's hop over to the US, where, like China, we're apparently a bit more transparent about chucking money at companies. As part of the Investing in America agenda, the US announced a $15.5 billion package of funding and loans to help companies transition to building EVs. The Heritage Foundation, loath though I am to cite that hotbed of fantasy neo-nationalist numbers, the best they can come up with is complaining about EV subsidies of $22 billion, with of course no reference to where that number comes from.
That was me?
Yeah, of course it was. Comparing that to the $757 billion that the US doled out to oil majors so they can proceed to kill us quicker is, well, if I don't laugh, I'll cry. So, since we're Randall Munroeing these numbers, if we tot up this imaginary 22 billion from the US with the 15... No, you know what? We know there's some money coming in from the provinces, so let's call it a nice round $20 billion that China's spent. And given that the Netherlands is the only European country I managed to get the actual budget for subsidies from, if you found one, put it in the comments, or ideally in the Discord chat room, I'm much more likely to see it there. And they're spending around €1 million per citizen. Using that as a value for the whole of the EU gets us €750 million, or around $800 million. So let's call it around billion. And that is the European subsidies we're going to tack in. All right, so 22 plus 20 plus 1, that's 43. Yeah, 43 billion to subsidize the transition to EVs, pitted against the $10 trillion that went to fossil fuels and conventional vehicles. Yeah. So I think one of the final things we should ask, despite the several orders of magnitude difference between what EVs get and what fossil fuels get, is that, despite that, have subsidies helped? And the answer, which is easily identifiable by the wailing noise that the fossil fuel industry is making about how terrible subsidies are and how unfair they are, is that, yeah, they've worked. And they do continue to work, although, as various papers have pointed out, there are concerns with how they've distorted the marketplace, skewing the market towards more expensive vehicles. And they are encouraging, in many ways, a non-equitable transition because they often favour those with higher incomes anyway. Some of the changes made over the past few years have started to address those concerns, but there's still a ton more work to do. But the evidence is pretty unequivocal. Subsidies drove China's early EV transition and have led to massive market leadership. Subsidies helped with the adoption of EVs worldwide. How we apply them going forward is a really interesting question. And how we level that playing field, the one where the industries killing us get trillions and the industries for cleaner transport and energy, they get the change from the couch cushions. That's a vital question we need to answer if we're going to survive on this planet. Thanks for joining me today. And if you've got thoughts, make sure you leave them below in our Discord chat room, or you can reach out to us on Mastodon. Thanks to the amazing list of people scrolling by on your screen right now. They are some of the more than 1,500 people who help fund this channel through Patreon and YouTube, covering our bills, paying our team, and making sure that we can be 100% independent. If you'd like to join them and see your name listed here, just follow the links below. There's a range of different tiers you can sign up for, from as little as $1 a month, or if you pay yearly, just under $11 a year. A huge welcome to our newest supporters: Bree Crockford, Cap, Christian Bual, Everything on a Bagel, Pitcher Ian, and Brett Chandler. To join the list and get your shout out, become a paid Patreon member for your week of fame. If you'd like to support us with a one-off donation, you'll find links below to make Ko-fi and Bitcoin donations, and we even have an old-fashioned PO box you can reach us at. Address is also down below. And if you're in need of some swag, you'll find our swag store in the down below too. We've got some great content coming up, so make sure you've subscribed on PeerTube or YouTube, and we'll see you soon. We make new videos every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. If you want more, the mighty algorithm thinks you'll like this video, but we think this one is also well worth a look. See you soon, and as always, keep evolving!